My name is Jane M. Say, 34 years old. I've been financially supporting my parents, Robert, 58M, and Isabelle, 56F, for the past 8 years, along with occasionally helping my younger sister, Ruth, 28F. I send them $3,000 monthly for their mortgage, utilities, groceries, and other expenses. Ruth gets help with her student loans and car payments when she asks. Sometimes I told myself it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet, just until Ruth stabilized, just until the next thing stopped being the next thing. But 8 years has a way of turning temporary into expectation. 3 years ago, I decided to build my dream house. I'm talking about a custom-designed, eco-friendly home with solar panels, smart home technology, and sustainable materials throughout. The kind of house you don't end up with by accident, the kind you plan on napkins, sketch in the margins of notebooks, and dream about when you're stuck in traffic wondering what your life would look like if you spent your money on yourself for once. I did most of the work myself. I'm licensed in both architecture and contracting and hired subcontractors only for specialized work like electrical and plumbing. The house sits on 5 acres of beautiful land I purchased outright. The property is worth about $800,000 now, and I put every penny of my own money into it. I also did about 60% of the physical labor myself, working nights and weekends for 2 years. My hands still bear the scars from countless cuts and calluses from that build. There were nights I came home so exhausted I couldn't even untie my boots without sitting down. But I still smiled, because every sore muscle meant the walls were standing, the roof was on, the dream was getting real. I didn't tell my parents every detail while I was building it, not because I didn't love them, but because I learned early that too much information in my family becomes shared property. If I said I had a good month, someone suddenly had an emergency. If I said I was ahead of schedule, someone suddenly needed just a little help. So I kept my head down. I kept sending the $3,000. I kept answering Ruth's texts when she asked for a quick favor, like guilt had a direct line to my phone. 2 months ago, I received legal papers that made my blood run cold. My parents, with Ruth as a co-plaintiff, were suing me for ownership of my house. Their claim was that because they raised me and sacrificed everything for my success, and because I've been living off their generosity by receiving financial support over the years, I owed them this house as compensation. Wait, what? Living off their generosity. I've been sending them $36,000 a year for 8 years. That's nearly $300,000 of my money supporting them, and they were calling it generosity like it was a gift I should be grateful to return. But it gets worse. They claim that because I occasionally stayed at their house when visiting, maybe 10 nights total over 3 years, and because they sometimes helped with small tasks during construction, bringing me lunch a few times, holding a board while I measured, they were entitled to ownership stakes in the property. Like a thermos of coffee and a sandwich could buy you 5 acres and a custom build. Like holding one end of a board for 30 seconds meant your name belonged on the deed. Ruth's reasoning was the most infuriating. Valeria has always been the favorite, getting all the opportunities. It's time for payback. We deserve something good for once. I read that line over and over until the letters blurred, because it wasn't even about money at that point. It was about resentment that had been fermenting quietly for years, while I paid their bills like I was paying for peace. Before the court date, I tried to resolve this privately. I invited them over for dinner, hoping we could work something out. That was a mistake. I cooked like we were still normal, like we were still a family that argued about politics and dessert and then hugged goodbye. I even set the table nicely. Cloth napkins, real plates, the ones I saved for holidays, because some part of me believed presentation could soften entitlement. They walked into my house like they were inspecting an investment. Isabelle's eyes went straight to the ceilings, the lighting, the open plan, the finishes. Robert lingered near the windows like he was imagining his own furniture against my walls. Ruth was lounging on my couch within 5 minutes, shoes off, scrolling on her phone like she already owned the place. Valeria, honey, my mom Isabelle, started using that condescending tone I'd grown to hate. You have to understand our position. We raised you. We supported your dreams. And now it's time for you to take care of us properly. She said properly like the last 8 years had been me tossing spare change into a jar. I send you $3,000 every month, I replied, trying to stay calm. I've been taking care of you. That's just money, my dad Robert interjected, leaning forward with his hands clasped like he was about to deliver wisdom. We're talking about security. We're getting older, and we need to know we'll have a place to live. This house is perfect for us. Perfect for us. Not for you, Jane. Not for the years you spent building it. Not for the hours you lost. Perfect for us. Ruth didn't even look up from her phone when she spoke. Plus, you can just build another one, right? You're good at this construction stuff. We can't just create a house out of nothing like you can. She said it like I had a magic wand instead of bruised knees and scarred hands. I stared at them in disbelief. This house took me 3 years to design and 2 years to build. I put my heart, soul, and every spare moment into it, and you want me to just hand it over and start again? Don't be so dramatic, Isabelle snapped, her voice sharper now that she realized I wasn't nodding. We're family. Family shares. You've always been selfish, Valeria. Even as a child, this is your chance to finally do something truly generous. That word, selfish, landed like a slap because I could feel every payment I'd sent, every time I'd said yes when I wanted to say no, every time I'd convinced myself love meant absorbing the cost. I looked around my kitchen, the clean lines, the sustainable wood, the careful design, and I realized they weren't seeing a home. They were seeing a solution, a way out, a prize. That's when I understood something that made my stomach drop. This wasn't a misguided attempt at securing their future. They genuinely believed they deserved my house, not part of it, not help, the whole thing. Like my life was an asset they could reassign. And the way they were sitting there, calm, confident, already talking about what they needed, told me they didn't come to dinner to negotiate, they came to train me. They came to pressure me into folding before the court ever happened. I kept my face composed, but inside, something started to harden. The kind of hard you get when you realize you're not in a family conversation anymore. You're in a legal fight with people who know exactly where you keep your soft spots. I asked one quiet question, mostly to test reality. If you win, where do you think I go? Isabelle blinked like the question was irrelevant. You'll be fine, honey. You always figure things out. You're resourceful. Ruth smirked like that was the point. Robert nodded like it was solved. You can stay with us for a while, he offered, as if the lawsuit wasn't them trying to take my home, as if he wasn't offering me a mattress in exchange for my deed. My throat tightened, not with tears, but with a sharp, clear anger that surprised me with how clean it felt. I realized I'd been afraid of disappointing them for so long that I forgot to ask myself what it meant that they were willing to destroy me and still call it family. I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of checking something on the stove, and I stood there with my hands on the counter, breathing slowly, listening to their voices drift from the living room. Isabelle was already talking about the guest room. Ruth was laughing softly at something on her screen. Robert was discussing next steps like we were closing on a purchase. I walked back in and looked at them, really looked at them, and I knew the courtroom wasn't going to be about fairness. It was going to be about survival. Because the people sitting in my home weren't asking for help. They were trying to take what I built and rewrite history so they could feel righteous doing it. And the worst part was, they were acting like they were certain they'd win. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not just the air conditioning, but the feeling that once you step into that room, your life turns into a story other people get to tell about you. My parents sat together on the plaintiff's side like a united front, Isabelle in her best church dress, Robert with his hands folded like he was about to pray. Ruth sat slightly behind them, scrolling on her phone until someone looked her way, then instantly switching into that innocent face like she wasn't the one who called it payback in black and white. They'd hired a lawyer who looked like he lived on family disputes and bruised egos, the kind of man who talks about equity and implied promises, like he's selling you something you didn't ask for. I'd hired Margaret, a sharp-as-nails real estate attorney who came highly recommended, the kind of woman who didn't waste words and didn't soften facts just because the people hearing them shared my DNA. The judge, Honorable Patricia Williams, looked skeptical from the start. Not angry, not sympathetic, just skeptical in that way that made me feel both relieved and terrified. Family court can be unpredictable, and I kept thinking, what if she hears the word parents and her heart overrides the law? My parents' lawyer opened like it was a morality play. He said family contributions and implied agreements gave my parents equity stakes in the property. He said they sacrificed for my success, that they supported me over the years, that I benefited from their generosity and now had an obligation to provide them security. He kept saying security like it was a magic word that turned entitlement into necessity. Then he did what I feared most. He tried to turn my house into a symbol, not of my work, but of their deprivation. He described my home like a mansion, like I was hoarding luxury while my parents struggled. He referred to me as ungrateful without using the word, just building the shape of it in every sentence. I sat there staring at the wood grain on the table in front of me and told myself, breathe. Let Margaret handle it. Facts don't bend because someone cries. But facts do get ugly when family lies under oath. Isabelle took the stand first. She walked up with that careful, practiced limp she sometimes uses when she wants sympathy. She held a tissue like a prop. When she sat down, she dabbed at her eyes before she even answered the first question. Your Honor, she began, I sacrificed everything for my daughter's success. I worked 2 jobs to pay for her education, went without so she could have opportunities, and now she lives in this beautiful home while we struggle to pay bills. I felt my jaw tighten. Beautiful home. Struggle to pay bills. She said it like I hadn't been sending $3,000 every month for 8 years. Their lawyer asked, has Jane been contributing to your household expenses? Isabelle waved dismissively. She sends some money, yes, but it's barely enough to cover our basic needs. Meanwhile, she's living in luxury. She's ungrateful, Your Honor. We deserve this house after everything we've done for her. Some money. Barely enough. I could practically hear my bank account screaming in the background. I wanted to stand up and shout the total, $288,000, but Margaret's hand rested lightly on my forearm, the silent reminder that I didn't need to explode if we had receipts. Then Robert took the stand and he turned on the theatrics like a switch. He sat taller than usual, shoulders back, voice fuller, like he was auditioning for the role of Father of the Year. Your Honor, my wife and I sacrificed everything for Jane's success. We refinanced our home to help pay for her college. We worked extra hours, missed family events, all so she could have a better life. And how does she repay us? By hoarding her success and leaving us to struggle. Hoarding. That word felt deliberate, like he wanted the judge to picture me clutching money to my chest while my parents starved. I thought about the nights I stayed late at work, the projects I took on, the careful budgeting, the sure I can help messages I sent when I was already stretched thin. Hoarding. The audacity made my hands go cold. Their lawyer asked, can you describe your involvement in the construction of the house? Robert straightened up proudly. Oh yes, we were very involved. I personally helped with the foundation work, assisted with framing, and supervised much of the construction. My wife provided meals for the work crew and managed supplies. Without our contribution, this house wouldn't exist. I nearly choked because I could see the scenes in my head, him standing at the edge of the site with a beer, watching me dig. Him holding one end of a board while I measured, then leaving after 30 minutes. Isabelle showing up with fast food twice and a thermos of coffee a handful of times. They weren't just exaggerating. They were rewriting my life in public, taking my labor and claiming it as theirs. Then Ruth took the stand, and she didn't even try to hide her nastiness. She walked up with a smirk that vanished the second she faced the judge, switching into wounded sister like she'd practiced in the mirror. Your Honor, she said, my sister has always been the golden child. Everything was always about Jane's achievements, Jane's dreams, Jane's success. My parents bankrupted themselves supporting her ambitions while I got the scraps. Their lawyer asked, what is your relationship with the defendant like? Ruth's face twisted into a sneer for half a second before she caught herself. Jane acts like she's so generous sending money every month, but it's guilt money. She knows she owes us. Finally, it's time for payback. We've been waiting for this moment for years. She has everything and we have nothing. This house should be ours. Hearing the word payback out loud in a courtroom hit different than reading it in a lawsuit. In writing, it felt like cruelty. Spoken under oath, it felt like a confession of motive. The judge's expression tightened slightly, just a flicker, but I noticed it, and it kept me from shaking apart. Still, sitting there while my own family painted me as a villain was its own kind of heartbreak. Not the dramatic crying kind. The quiet grief kind, like something inside you realizes it's been mourning for years and just didn't have the words. Margaret didn't react visibly. She didn't roll her eyes or sigh. She just took notes, precise and calm, like she'd seen every form of manipulation dressed up as family. When the plaintiffs rested, I should have felt relief. Instead, my stomach churned, because now it was my turn to be dissected. Now I had to sit on that stand and explain, carefully, politely, why the people who raised me were lying. Margaret stood and called me. As I walked to the stand, I could feel my parents watching me like I was a betrayal in motion. Isabelle's lips were tight, Robert's jaw set, Ruth's eyes bright with anticipation like she expected me to crack, like she expected tears, like she expected me to beg for mercy from the very people trying to take my house. I sat down, swore the oath, and looked straight ahead. Margaret's voice was steady. Miss Say, can you describe your financial relationship with your parents over the past 8 years? I took a breath and reminded myself, facts don't flinch. I pulled out my bank statements, all meticulously organized. I have documentation showing that I've sent my parents $3,000 every month for the past 8 years, totaling $288,000. This covers their mortgage, utilities, groceries, medical expenses, car payments, and discretionary spending. I saw Isabelle's eyes widen slightly, like she wasn't expecting me to say the total out loud. Robert's face tightened, the faintest panic flickering beneath his confidence. Margaret continued, and your sister Ruth has received approximately $45,000 over the past 5 years for student loan payments, car repairs, insurance, and various personal expenses she's requested help with. Ruth's posture changed. She sat up straighter, like she wanted to object without objecting. Margaret asked, can you describe the construction process of your home? This is where my voice almost faltered, not from fear, but from the weight of remembering. I designed every inch of this house myself. I obtained all the necessary permits under my contractor's license. I personally excavated the foundation, laid the groundwork, framed the structure, installed insulation, and handled most of the interior finishing work. I have time-lapse videos, photos, and detailed blogs showing my work progression over the 2-year construction period. Margaret asked the key question, did your parents contribute financially to this construction? No. Every material, every permit fee, every subcontractor payment came from my personal savings and income. The total investment was approximately $650,000 of my own money, plus roughly 2,000 hours of my personal labor. I watched the judge's pen pause, just for a second. Margaret asked, what about their claimed physical contributions? I let out a controlled breath. My father visited the construction site maybe 15 times over 2 years. His help consisted of holding boards while I measured and occasionally moving small items. My mother brought me food perhaps 5 times. I appreciate those gestures, but they don't constitute meaningful construction contribution. When Margaret finished her direct questions, I thought I could finally breathe. Then their lawyer stood up, and I felt the real fight begin. He didn't go after the permits or the labor first. He went after my character, because that's what people do when facts don't serve them. Miss Say, isn't it true that without your parents' sacrifices, you wouldn't have achieved your current success? I kept my face calm. I'm grateful for my upbringing, but I've more than repaid any investments they made in my education through the $288,000 I provided over 8 years, plus additional support for Ruth. Don't you think you owe them security in their golden years? I believe I've been providing exactly that security through consistent financial support that covers all their living expenses. He tried to corner me emotionally. Isn't it true you have stayed at their home when visiting, benefiting from their hospitality? Maybe 10 nights total over 3 years, I said, and I have paid them $3,000 monthly during that time. I don't believe occasional overnight stays create ownership rights in my property. He frowned, like I was supposed to sound guiltier, like he wanted me to crumble and admit I felt indebted enough to hand over my house. I didn't. When the cross-examination ended, my legs felt shaky beneath the table, but my mind was oddly clear. The courtroom wasn't reacting like my parents expected. The judge wasn't nodding with sympathy at their speeches. She was listening, yes, but she wasn't buying the performance. Still, I was terrified, because I'd learned the hard way that being right doesn't always mean you win, especially when people weaponize emotions. Margaret leaned toward me slightly and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Stay steady, we're not done." Then she stood when closing arguments were about to begin, and her voice cut through the room like a blade. Your Honor, before you make your ruling, there's one additional piece of evidence I'd like to present that's crucial to this case. Judge Williams looked up, intrigued. Proceed, counselor. And in that moment, I saw my parents' faces change. Robert went pale. Isabelle's hands started to tremble. Ruth's mouth tightened like she'd swallowed something bitter. They weren't confident anymore. They were scared. Margaret walked to the bench with a thick folder in her hands, the kind that doesn't contain feelings or arguments, just facts sharp enough to cut through whatever story was just told. She handed a copy to the judge and another to opposing counsel. The quiet in the courtroom shifted. It wasn't just tense anymore. It was expectant. Your Honor, Margaret said, while the plaintiffs have framed this as a matter of family sacrifice and implied equity, the financial records tell a very different story. I glanced at my parents. Robert was staring straight ahead, jaw clenched. Isabel's eyes flicked between Margaret and the folder, like she was trying to read the outcome from a distance. Ruth looked irritated at first, then uncertain. Margaret continued, voice steady, precise. Robert and Isabelle say refinanced their home in 2019. They testified that this refinance was to support Jane's education and professional development. However, these records show that the refinance occurred years after Jane had already completed her degree and established her business. My heart skipped. I hadn't known what was in that folder. Margaret had been careful, strategic. She'd told me she was digging, but not how deep. The funds from that refinance, she said, were not used for educational support. They were invested in a restaurant venture that closed within 8 months due to financial mismanagement and significant gambling losses incurred by Robert Say. The word gambling hung in the air like smoke. My jaw dropped before I could stop it. I had no idea. None. I'd believed their narrative about sacrifice. I'd built part of my guilt on it. I'd told myself I owed them because they'd stretched themselves thin for me. But this... Margaret turned slightly, letting the silence stretch before she delivered the next blow. Furthermore, the $3,000 monthly payments Jane has been making do not merely cover basic living expenses. Bank records show that substantial portions of these funds were transferred to casino accounts and used to cover gambling debts, including losses totaling $23,000 in the past 6 months alone. The courtroom went completely silent. Robert's face drained of color. Isabelle shook her head slightly, but not in denial, more like in disbelief that it was being said out loud. Ruth stared at her father like she was seeing him for the first time. Margaret wasn't finished. Ruth Say, while claiming she received scraps compared to her sister, has received approximately $45,000 in direct support from Jane over 5 years. However, Ruth failed to disclose that she inherited $80,000 from her maternal grandmother's estate in 2021. Funds that were not shared and were not used to reduce her financial dependence on Jane. Ruth's eyes widened. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She looked exposed, smaller. "But here's the most shocking element of this case, Your Honor," Margaret said, her tone sharpening. 3 weeks ago, Robert and Isabelle Say attempted to take out a mortgage against Jane's property without her knowledge or consent. They submitted preliminary loan documents containing a forged signature and falsified power of attorney forms. A collective gasp moved through the courtroom like a ripple. Even I felt the floor shift beneath me. Margaret placed another document on the judge's desk. "We have statements from the mortgage company flagging irregularities in the application. We have a signed affidavit from a handwriting expert confirming the signature was not Jane's. We have electronic communication records showing coordination between the plaintiffs during the submission process." I turned slowly to look at my parents. Robert avoided my eyes. Isabel's hands were shaking openly now. "This lawsuit," Margaret continued, "is not about sacrifice. It is not about implied equity. It is an attempt to secure an asset in order to cover escalating debts and potential financial collapse, including gambling losses that Jane has unknowingly subsidized for years." The judge leaned forward. "Is this true? Did you attempt to mortgage property that does not belong to you?" Robert opened his mouth, then closed it again. Their lawyer leaned in urgently, whispering something that sounded suspiciously like, "Don't speak." Margaret delivered the final strike with controlled force. The plaintiffs were unusually confident about their chances in this lawsuit. That confidence stemmed not from legal merit, but from the belief that they would either intimidate Jane into surrendering the property or secure leverage through fraudulent financial action. The room felt heavy, like truth had weight. Judge Williams removed her glasses and looked directly at my parents. "I have been a family court judge for 15 years. I have seen bitter divorces, inheritance disputes, custody battles. I have never seen such a clear case of manipulation, deception, and attempted fraud disguised as a family property dispute." She paused, letting the words settle. "Not only are your claims without merit, but the attempted mortgage action constitutes potential criminal fraud. I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation." My heart pounded in my ears. She turned to me. "Miss Say, you are the sole and uncontested owner of your property. There is no legal basis for the plaintiff's claim. Furthermore, given the evidence presented, this court is issuing a restraining order prohibiting the plaintiffs from contacting you or coming within 500 feet of your property." Isabel's breath hitched. Ruth began crying quietly. Robert looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. "To the plaintiffs," Judge Williams continued, "you should be ashamed. Your daughter has supported you financially for 8 years. Your response was to attempt fraud and file a frivolous lawsuit. This behavior is reprehensible." The gavel came down. "Case dismissed with prejudice. Court is adjourned." The sound echoed in my chest like something final. As I stood, my legs felt strangely light. My parents tried to approach me, but the bailiff stepped forward immediately and reminded them about the restraining order. For the first time in my life, a boundary wasn't just emotional. It was legal. Margaret squeezed my shoulder gently as we walked out. "You did exactly what you needed to do," she said quietly. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, cleaner. But underneath, the relief was something else. A dawning awareness that this wasn't just the end of a lawsuit. It was the end of the illusion that my family had ever seen me as anything other than a resource. And I still had no idea how deep the consequences were about to go. Walking out of that courthouse felt surreal, like stepping out of a storm and realizing the landscape behind you had been permanently altered. My parents stood frozen near the entrance, their lawyer whispering urgently to them, Ruth clutching her purse like it could somehow restore control. The bailiff's reminder about the restraining order echoed louder than anything else that day. Margaret and I went to a nearby restaurant afterward, partly to decompress, partly because I didn't trust myself to go home alone yet. My hands were still shaking slightly as I wrapped them around a glass of water. "When you mentioned they seemed unusually confident," Margaret said calmly, "I knew something else was driving this. People don't gamble their dignity on weak legal claims unless they believe they have leverage." Leverage. The word sat heavy in my chest. She explained how she'd hired a private investigator once she suspected there was more beneath the surface. A loan officer had contacted her office quietly after noticing inconsistencies in the mortgage application tied to my property. The forged signature, the falsified power of attorney, the urgency in the paperwork. "They were trying to use your house as collateral before the lawsuit even concluded," she said. "They needed cash, fast." I felt nauseated thinking about how close they'd come. If the loan officer hadn't flagged the irregularities, if Margaret hadn't been thorough, if I had trusted them just a little more. The next morning, I sent a certified letter to my parents and Ruth, formally terminating all financial support. 8 years, nearly $350,000. Done. No more $3,000 monthly payments, no more car repairs, no more emergency transfers labeled temporary. That letter was only 3 pages long, but it felt like cutting a cord that had been wrapped around my spine. The consequences began quickly. Within a week, Robert was arrested for mortgage fraud and forgery. The district attorney's office did not treat forged property documents lightly, especially at the dollar amounts involved. I didn't attend the hearing. I didn't need to. Margaret kept me updated. Isabelle wasn't formally charged at first, but she was named as a co-conspirator in the investigation. The humiliation was public. The local paper picked it up. The story wasn't framed as a family misunderstanding. It was framed as attempted financial fraud. Ruth tried calling me the same night the arrest happened. The restraining order didn't stop her from dialing. She left voicemails at first, crying, claiming she didn't know about the mortgage paperwork, saying Dad had handled everything, saying she'd been manipulated too. Then she switched tactics. She called from a different number and actually got through. I didn't speak much. I recorded everything and forwarded it to Margaret. "You're destroying this family," she said through sobs. "Dad could go to prison." I replied calmly, "Dad destroyed this family when he forged my signature." She hung up. 2 weeks later, my grandmother on my father's side called me. Grandma Rose. Her voice was steady, but disappointed. "Valeria," she said, "I had no idea what your father had become. I'm so sorry this happened to you." It turned out she'd learned about everything through extended relatives and had been quietly asking questions. Questions my father apparently didn't answer well. Fast forward 6 months. Robert was sentenced to 2 years in prison for fraud, though he would likely serve 14 months with good behavior. The judge at sentencing did not mince words. Betrayal of family trust for financial gain represents one of the most egregious forms of deception. Isabelle had to sell their house to cover legal fees and accumulated gambling debts. That's when the full picture surfaced. They owed over $150,000 in various debts, payday loans, credit cards threatening lawsuits, IRS notices from the failed restaurant venture. The refinance hadn't been sacrifice, it had been desperation. The house sale barely covered the damage. They moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment in a rougher part of town. Isabelle, who hadn't worked in over a decade, took a job at a local diner. I heard she looked older, tired, smaller somehow. Ruth lost her job at the bank once the fraud case became public. Banks don't tolerate association with financial crime, even indirectly. She was escorted out the same day the newspaper ran the sentencing article. She moved back in with Isabelle. For the first time in her life, there was no safety net beneath her entitlement. And for the first time in mine, there was no financial obligation hanging over my head. The silence after that last transfer cleared from my account was almost shocking. I hadn't realized how much background stress that monthly withdrawal carried until it disappeared. Without that $3,000 payment and Ruth's periodic requests, I suddenly had an extra $40,000 per year to invest in myself. I used it to expand my business. I hired 2 additional contractors, purchased new equipment, rented a proper office space instead of working from my dining table. Within 4 months, I landed a major commercial project designing sustainable office buildings for a progressive tech company. The project was worth $2.3 million, more than I had made in the previous 3 years combined. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same house my family tried to steal became my greatest professional asset. It was featured in 2 design magazines. A third feature was scheduled in Sustainable Living Quarterly. A documentary filmmaker reached out about including it in a series on innovative eco-homes. My home became proof that I could build something solid without leaning on anyone. But success didn't erase the grief. I went to therapy for a few months. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez helped me unpack something I hadn't wanted to see. What I experienced wasn't just entitlement, it was financial abuse, emotional conditioning. My parents had trained me for years to feel responsible for their stability. They planted guilt like seeds and watered it with obligation. Every compliment about my success was followed by a reminder of their sacrifice. Every achievement was subtly tied to a future debt. Ruth's resentment wasn't new either. It had been nurtured quietly, reinforced by comparisons and whispers about fairness. The lawsuit wasn't sudden. It was culmination. And once I saw that, the guilt started to lose its grip. Grandma Rose passed away peacefully not long after Robert's sentencing. She was 94. In her will, she left her estate entirely to me, $400,000 plus her Victorian home in the countryside. In her handwritten note, she wrote, "To Jane M. Say, who built something beautiful with her own hands and never forgot the value of honest work. Your father could learn from your example." I cried when I read that. Not because of the money, because someone in my family had finally seen me clearly. I sold the Victorian house and used part of the inheritance to start a nonprofit foundation that helps young women train in construction and architecture. It felt like turning something broken into something that could build others up. But just when life felt steady, just when the legal dust had settled, just when I believed the drama had burned itself out, something happened that reminded me, toxic patterns don't die quietly. They escalate, and Ruth was about to test that. I wasn't going to add this part to my story because at some point you just want the narrative to end cleanly. Court victory, boundaries set, life rebuilt, fade to black. But toxic people rarely accept clean endings. Yesterday, Ruth showed up at my workplace. Not quietly, not to apologize. She stormed into the lobby of my office building mid-afternoon while I was in a meeting with 2 contractors reviewing blueprints. My receptionist, Janet, knocked softly on the conference room door with a look on her face that told me something was wrong before she said a word. "Jane, there's someone here insisting on seeing you." I stepped into the hallway and heard Ruth before I saw her. She was shouting my name. "Jane, you don't get to ignore us. You don't get to pretend we don't exist." Security had already been called, but she was moving around the lobby like she owned the air. Her hair looked poorly dyed, roots showing. She'd lost weight. Too much. Her clothes hung off her frame and her shoes looked worn, secondhand. The contrast between this version of her and the confident sister who smirked in court was jarring. And then I saw the car. Isabelle was sitting in the passenger seat in the parking lot, the window half down. She looked smaller than I remembered, frail, older than 56, her face pale, her posture slumped. Ruth pointed dramatically toward the car. "Look at her, Jane. Look what you've done." The words hit like a rehearsed line. Security asked her to lower her voice. She ignored them. "Mom is sick," she said loudly. "Diabetes complications. She needs treatment. Medical bills are piling up. And you're sitting here in your fancy office pretending you're some hero." There it was. The pivot. "Family is family," Ruth said, her voice breaking just enough to sound convincing. "You're successful because of Mom's sacrifices. You owe her. You owe us." For a split second, I felt something dangerous flicker in my chest. Guilt is a reflex when it's been conditioned for years. Seeing Isabelle looking weak in that car could have cracked the old version of me open instantly. But the old version of me would have been cornered at home, not standing in a professional lobby with legal boundaries in place. I walked forward calmly. Ruth, you testified in court that it was time for payback. You said you'd been waiting for that moment for years. Dad forged my signature. You all tried to take my house. Her eyes flashed. That was different. This is medical. This is life and death. I kept my voice even. Mom has Medicare. There are charity programs. You figured out how to coordinate a mortgage fraud attempt. You can figure out a payment plan. Her expression shifted from pleading to fury. You're heartless. You're killing your own mother. Security stepped closer. I could hear sirens faintly in the distance. You don't get to rewrite this, I said quietly. I protected myself from people who tried to destroy my life. She took a step toward me, but security blocked her path. You think you're better than us because you built a house, because you got famous, because you have money. You abandoned us. You tried to take my home through fraud, I replied. That was abandonment first. She opened her mouth to scream something else, but the police officers entered the lobby before she could finish. The restraining order violation was clear. They placed her in handcuffs while she was still shouting about how I'd regret this forever. Isabelle never got out of the car. She just stared straight ahead while Ruth was led past her, still ranting. Apparently this wasn't Ruth's first violation attempt either. Margaret later told me this could escalate the consequences significantly. For about 5 minutes after the police left, I stood in the lobby and felt the aftershock. Not rage, not triumph, just clarity. Some people will use any crisis, even illness, even genuine hardship, to reopen a door they think you're weak enough to unlock. But weakness and compassion are not the same thing. I returned to my conference room, apologized to my contractors for the disruption, and continued discussing the project timeline. Later that evening, sitting in my kitchen, I looked around the house they tried to take. The skylights, the beams I sanded myself, the garden I planted with my own hands. This house is not just wood and glass and concrete. It's proof. Proof that I can create something stable without sacrificing myself. Proof that boundaries don't make you cruel. Proof that sometimes the hardest decision is the one that saves you. And here's the truth no one talks about when they say, but they're your family. DNA does not entitle anyone to your security. Shared history does not justify manipulation. And love is not measured by how much you're willing to let someone take from you. My life now is full. My business is thriving. My nonprofit is growing. And I wake up every morning knowing that no one can legally or emotionally corner me into surrendering what I built. Sometimes the best revenge isn't loud. It's simply living well in a house that is finally undeniably mine.